Welcome back, everybody, to the High Bricks Cultivation System. Today, we're going to be talking about integrating micro and macro livestock into your grow or your farm or your garden. So, when we talk about micro livestock, what we're really going to cover here is worms, earthworms, mites, beetles, and then other critters that live in the soil. And then, of course, macro livestock, referring to animals, we'll talk about rabbits and a couple different types of ruminants. Now, you know from our discussion about regenerative agriculture that animals can play a critical role in regenerating an ecosystem and building a healthy ecosystem and building living soils. But why are we talking about micro livestock? Well, as you may recall, when we talked about the soil food web, we talked about how there's all these different species of microorganisms living in the soil that are important to the soil food web. Some of them are microscopic, but the ones that are big enough to see but are still really small, those are what we call micro livestock. And they are crucial to growing high bricks and having a healthy ecosystem. You can see here from that image of those cows up in the top right corner that even though we might think of these things as small, their mass in the soil is actually pretty large and is equivalent to about 20 cows per square meter of land. That's not a very big area, and yet you've got the mass of about 20 cows of microbial life potentially in that small an area. So these micro livestock really play a big role in the whole system. Now we can see from the scale here that actually bacteria and fungi, even though they're the smallest, they actually have the biggest mass. But then following right behind them we have nematodes, which are sometimes big enough to see, but then we get into the visible, what we call the micro livestock, springtails, other mites, millipedes, centipedes, fly larvae, beetles, earthworms, spiders. And so we're going to talk about some of these specifically, a few of them that are really crucial to the ecosystem, and if you introduce them intentionally, are going to help you to start to build a healthy ecosystem that is cycling organic matter, providing fertility for your plants, and keeping out pests. So first we're going to talk about earthworms, and we're going to spend a significant amount of time on earthworms because earthworms are potentially the most important of all these micro livestock. Earthworms really have no downsides, they have no enemies in the soil, and they have huge benefits for the soil ecosystem. So in addition to cultivating earthworms in your soil, we're also going to encourage you to breed worms outside your soil and to have your own worm composting bin where you can create your own worm castings. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but first let's talk about, just get familiar with the earthworm and the life cycle of an earthworm. So after earthworms mate, there's a mucus ring that passes over the head of the worm as it hardens into a cocoon. And then the worm releases that cocoon. It looks like a little round white egg, basically. And later on, baby worms will hatch from the cocoon after about 3 weeks. And then the worms take about 3 months to become full adults and when they're able to mate themselves. So that's the life cycle of an earthworm. So they grow and reproduce relatively quickly. And even getting in a little bit more detail with the anatomy of an earthworm, earthworms are really fascinating creatures, and what's amazing about them is what goes in one end is not as good as what comes out the other end. Some other amazing things about worms is they actually breathe through their skin. And this is important to know because in order for worms to continue breathing, they have to have a coating of mucus around them. So this means earthworms need a moist environment, and if they get too dried out, they will die. So you've got to keep your soil moist enough to keep those earthworms alive. Another interesting aspect of earthworms is that they have what's called a gizzard. You might have heard of this in the context of birds like turkeys. A gizzard is an organ that has little rocks or little hard materials in it that help the creature to break down harder materials, kind of crush them up, essentially. So an earthworm actually has a gizzard with tiny little rocks in it that will help it to crush up harder materials that it may ingest. So earthworms can ingest a lot of different materials. And another interesting thing about earthworms is that they are hermaphrodites. So they have both a male and a female sex organ, and so any earthworm can mate with any other earthworm. One more important thing to know about earthworms is that they actually cannot survive in direct sunlight for very long, only for about an hour. So if you ever pulled a worm out of the soil and saw it wriggling around, it's because it's trying to get back to where it's dark. You might have noticed that when you put an earthworm on the ground, it will, as quickly as it can, try to go back under the soil. If they do not like the light, they will ultimately die from the light, so they like the darkness. So this is part of why your worm bin, if you have one, needs to stay covered, and it's part of why you will not see the earthworms come up to the top of the soil in the daytime, but they will come up at night and eat things off the top of the soil. And again, like we said, earthworms are hermaphrodites, so any worm can mate with any other. This is what it looks like when they are mating. So as we've already talked about previously, worm castings, also known as vermicompost, are extremely valuable. They are really one of the best things that you can give to your soil. They're actually at least 2 times higher in calcium, 5 times higher in nitrogen, and 7 times higher in phosphorus and potassium than just regular soil is. So they are a rich fertilizer, and yet they will never burn your plants either, because those nutrients are in an organic form that is locked up and not readily available to the plants. It needs to be made available by microorganisms, but they're very rich in plant essential nutrients. However, the other thing that's really great about worm castings is that they are teeming with microbial life, with bacteria and fungi. So it's not just the nutrients that you get with the vermicompost, it's also all that microbial life too. And this is why earlier we recommended getting local worm castings, or really what we were talking about was fresh worm castings. Because worm castings that are in a bag, they've probably been filtered and screened and homogenized, so a lot of the bigger chunks have been taken out, and they've honestly probably lost a lot of the beneficial microbial life. They're still going to have the bacteria and the fungi, but worm castings that are more fresh will even have other larger creatures crawling around in them. And sometimes they will not be completely decomposed, which could actually be a good thing because now you're providing more food for all that microbial life and those other micro livestock. So really, if you can go for local worm castings, that's the best, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And so here you can see an image of some worm castings actually from where I live, from our worm bin. You can see that there's bits and pieces of decaying organic matter in here, and if you look closely, there's other critters crawling around there. You can see a worm, you can also see some roly-polies, some isopods, and you can also see some little white specks, which are actually springtail mites. So these local, homemade worm castings are just much more alive. Now, not all earthworms are created equal. There are different species, different types of earthworms, and these different types have different behaviors and different potential benefits. So the ones you're probably most familiar with are the red wigglers. Those are the most commonly used composting worms. They're typically what most people who are selling composting worms will sell. They are really voracious eaters. They reproduce and eat really quickly. So they're just ideal for composting if you're having a dedicated worm bin where your goal is to make worm castings specifically, then red wigglers are good for that. Now, the one thing about red wigglers is that they tend to stay closer to the soil surface. They don't go down really deep. And this is part of what makes them good for a worm composting bin. But if you want to get the full benefit of earthworms, you want to have some that will go down deeper in the soil and create those channels, aerate the soil, and also spread their worm castings down deeper in the soil, so that when your roots of your plants eventually get down there, they will have some nutrients and aeration as well. So for that, the nightcrawler varieties are really good. Both the African and the European nightcrawlers will go down deeper in the soil, and they will come back up to the surface of the soil at night. That's why they're called the nightcrawlers. And then some varieties of worms just do better in different climates. So if you are doing this outside and climate is a consideration for you, then you may want to look at which worms do better in which climates. The blue worms are really more suited for tropical climates, whereas the red wigglers, they do well in a lot of different and pretty wide climate, but generally a temperate climate. The African nightcrawlers are also a subtropical or a tropical variety, whereas the European nightcrawlers do well in more temperate climates. So if you're going to start a worm bin, one important consideration is the container. Now you can go online and buy a bin that's specially made for composting. These are typically made of plastic. You may have seen these worm towers before with multiple layers on them, and I've never used one of those, so I can't speak to really how well they work. Clearly they are designed specifically for worm composting, but I've always just done it in just finding any old plastic bin, really can work. Plastic, is easy to use. It doesn't absorb liquids too much, and you'll want to poke some little holes in it for aeration. And then of course if you poke holes near the bottom, you'll want to have a catchment tray for liquid that might leak out, and then you want to have a cover too. But plastic can work pretty well. Cardboard is probably not going to last very long. It's going to absorb a lot of the liquid and lose its structure pretty quickly. A wood box could be a good idea. You'll just want to pay attention to the type of wood, make sure that it's not pressure treated wood, and that it's fairly resistant to rotting and composting itself. And then, in my opinion, metal is not really a great solution, although some people may use this, but you risk rusting, you risk metals leaching into your bin, and you still have to aerate it, so you're going to have to drill some holes in there, which is going to be a little harder than plastic bin. Now another thing that could work is if you are growing in fabric pots and you happen to have another extra fabric pot, those are designed to aerate and to wick water, but they also will contain the worms, so fabric pots could also be a good solution for your worm bin. Now the way that you feed your worm bin is really the most important thing of all. This is the trickiest part, although it doesn't have to be super tricky. There's just a few important rules that you have to remember. One is that there are certain foods that you just never want to feed your worms. So meat is not a good idea, dairy products, paper is really good for worms, but you don't want paper that is heavily coated in wax or ink. Ink can be okay, but something that has a lot of ink on it, probably not as great. You just don't want any kind of chemicals that are going to contaminate and potentially kill off the worms. Also, you want to stay away from citrus. Worms don't like citrus. So those are the things to avoid. Besides that, you can really feed them all kinds of different food scraps, and they will readily eat the food scraps. Actually, really what they're eating is the fungus on the food scraps. And then eggshells are something that's talked about feeding worms a lot. Eggshells can be really good for the worms. They can be good, they can be dealt with by that gizzard and actually can be really good for their gizzard. Eggshells can also provide a great source of calcium, add some extra calcium into your worm castings. The trick with the eggshells is you want to make sure that you break them up into smaller pieces. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for the worms to consume the larger chunks of eggshells. But if you break them up nice and small, they'll consume them pretty readily. And it could be a good idea to cook them. Cooked eggshells will be softer and easier for the worms to digest. And then other good things for the worms are really any kind of plant material. So worms can actually eat peat moss and the different peat moss substitutes that we talked about. So if you're using that in your soil mix, they already have a source of food there. And then any plant leaf material that you should be, as you're trimming your plants, throwing the leaf material on top of your soil to let it decompose. That's a great thing for the worms to eat. And now we're getting into feeding worms in the soil. So if you're feeding them in a worm bin, you can feed them all kinds of food scraps. Just make sure that the moisture content doesn't get too high. If things get too wet, they can start to go anaerobic. And ultimately, if that anaerobic environment takes over, it won't be so great for the worms. But you don't want them to get too dry either. So balancing that moisture content is really the key thing to keep in mind, and that's why adding newspaper or adding cardboard, ideally ripped up first, but that can help to soak up some of that excess moisture that you might get from the food scraps. Now, when it comes to feeding worms that are living in your soil, you can add food scraps to the top of your soil. You just want to make sure you don't overdo it, because those food scraps, if they pile up, they can also start to rot and go anaerobic, and that's not good for your soil. So you'll want to add food scraps sparingly, and this is where leafy material and other plant material that you want to decompose can be really great for the top of your soil. Now, one thing is that worms cannot eat through wood. So wood will take a long time to start breaking down. Ultimately, the fungus will have to come on there and start to break it down, and then eventually the worms will be able to eat that. But woody material will take a long time, and the worms are not going to eat that. So, as we just hinted at, one strategy you might want to employ is just simply to do your worm composting in your soil itself. There is actually a special worm bin that is made for this. It's made to just go and sit down in the soil, and that way you can keep your worms contained. But if you are growing in a pot or in a raised bed, you don't have to worry about that containment, and so you can do your worm composting just on the soil. Again, if you feed it food scraps, more on the sparing side, but mostly feed it plant material, as you're growing your cover crop and cutting that cover crop down, that cover crop, soft plant material, can become a really great food source for your worms and for your other micro livestock. Alright, now we're going to talk about something that got popularized on Instagram a few years ago by the handle Blue of Green Tank over in Maine, from my home state. The idea behind the avocado tech is that worms really love to eat avocados. If you've ever done worm composting and you've put an avocado into your bin, you'll see that they just go after it and eat it really quickly. And so the avocado can actually be a way to attract worms and get them to start mating and reproducing more quickly. So the idea here is you just take this avocado, you cut it in half, and you take the core out and put it face down on top of the soil. Burying it in the soil a little bit is the most ideal thing, and then let it sit there for about 2 weeks without disturbing it. And if you do that after 2 weeks, if you pick it up, you will see a mass of worms congregating in there, something like this. And those worms will be mating and reproducing and producing eggs. Now you see all this white stuff here. There are some worm cocoons in there, but actually most of these white things that you see are springtail mites. So this is the secondary benefit of the avocado tech, is it helps to breed springtail mites as well. And here in this avocado, you can see the little round, white but kind of translucent dots. Those little balls, those are the worm cocoons, to be distinguished from the mites, which are a little bit longer. And in this image here, you can see again the worms all congregating. This is from right under an avocado, and it's just lifted up, and all those worms are there, feasting on the avocado, mating with each other, and the springtail mites are taking off too. And that leads us into our next micro livestock to talk about, the springtail mites. Springtail mites are another foundational micro livestock of your soil ecosystem. Now, springtail mites are really fascinating creatures. They're called springtails as their common name because you can see here they have this long tail at the end that allows them to jump to many times their body length. So they can just spring around that way. They don't fly. If you see something flying, it's not a springtail mite. Now, when I first saw these, I actually thought from the previous picture that they were like little maggots or something, or fly larvae, but at closer examination, you'll see that they are these springtail mites, which are really great for your soil. They're great because they are amazing decomposers. So just like the worms, they will break down organic material that's in your soil and that you put into your soil. And remember, decomposition is the key to making nutrients available to plants and ultimately to growing high bricks, keeping that soil ecosystem churning. Now, another great thing about springtail mites is that they are beneficial predators. So they will actually eat fungus gnat larvae, and they will eat thrips, which are two pests that are pretty nasty and that nobody wants to have around. Now, while springtail mites will eat all kinds of different organic matter, there are some specific things that you can feed them that they especially like if you want to breed them and increase your populations. And you can even breed them separately, just like earthworms if you wanted to. So shrimp pellets, they really love shrimp pellets, and even just the fish flakes that you would feed to an aquarium with fish is another favorite food of springtail mites. They will also eat nutritional yeast. Just make sure that it's non-GMO nutritional yeast. They will also eat other dead insects. Crickets are a popular one, but they'll eat all kinds of dead insects. Again, they're decomposers. They're not predators, and they're not going to eat your live plants either. Some people get very nervous when they see these things taking off in their soil, and they see huge populations, and they might think, oh my god, these things are going to start attacking my plants. But they only eat dead things. So they eat dead insects, they eat dead plant material, they will eat leaves. Leaves are a great thing for them. They will also help to eat decaying wood. And if you used rice hulls as aeration, they will also eat rice hulls. So there's a lot of different things that they will eat, and you don't really have to worry too much about them getting out of control, because again, they only eat dead things, and they eat microscopic pests that we don't like. So really, they're just beneficial. This is actually a picture of the surface of soil right after pouring water on the soil. The water stirred up all this huge population of springtail mites. Now remember that balance in the ecosystem is important, and so if you're getting huge populations of something like springtail mites, even though they are beneficial, you might want to consider that something in your ecosystem is out of balance. It's essentially just a sign that there could be an imbalance in your ecosystem, and you might want to take a look at that. And how do we balance out a population that's getting out of control? Well, we can introduce a predator. So next, we are going to talk about a predator that you can introduce for your springtail mites, and that serves a lot of other functions. This is the rove beetle. So rove beetles are pretty fascinating creatures. They look a little bit like a cross between an ant and a beetle, and there's several different types of them that come in a couple different colors, as you can see on the left here. Some of them are all black, and some of them have little red parts of them. Those are the species that tend to bite, so you want to be a little bit careful with those. But otherwise, rove beetles, just like springtail mites, are great beneficials for your soil that will never attack your plants or cause any harm. They really can just do good. They have an interesting ability to infiltrate ant colonies. They can actually put out pheromones that allow them to pose as ants. And of course, since they look a little bit like ants, the ants are fooled Ants are pretty protective and typically good at fighting off threats, but the rove beetles can get in there and do whatever they want, steal food, whatever. They also have a similar diet to springtail mites, so luckily you can feed basically your worms, your springtail mites, and your rove beetles pretty much the same stuff, really all kinds of organic matter. And a lot like the springtail mites, they will also eat the pests that you don't like. Fungus gnats especially, thrips, and the dreaded root aphids. And rove beetles will also eat springtail mites. A few other things about rove beetles to note: they have a pretty wide temperature range, although certain species do better in certain temperatures. So most likely if you purchase these, you'll get ones that are suited to your local climate. Now if you're growing outside, these rove beetles and these springtail mites are probably just going to show up in your soil, honestly. You may not even have to do anything. You may not even have to intentionally introduce species of these or colonies of these. But you can purchase these and intentionally build up colonies. As we saw, the springtail mites really like to go into where the worms are. So again, if you're outside and you have a connection to the outdoor ecosystem, probably these guys will just start to show up. So back to the rove beetles, they do have a wide temperature range. They also do prefer higher humidity too, so if you're in a dry climate, you may not see them show up. But there'll be other critters there to replace them, like roly-polies, for example. Where I am, in California, we don't really see a lot of rove beetles, but we do see ground beetles and we see roly-polies in pretty high numbers. Now, if you're growing indoors or in a greenhouse, the humidity might be suitable for rove beetles. And then finally, some other critters that you may want to intentionally introduce to your soil, or again, that may just show up in your soil if you have a healthy ecosystem and organic matter for them to eat, and you're not in a totally closed environment, either indoors or in an apartment or something like that. So this is another predatory beneficial mite. Let's see if I can say this name right. Stratiolaelaps scymitus. All right. Formerly known, until it was recently reclassified, as Hypiosis miles. Now this is not as common of a mite, so it doesn't have a common name like the springtails. But it is a very beneficial predatory mite. They eat fungus gnats and thrips as well. You can see what they look like here. So again, look for these in your soil, or you can buy them specifically. They are sold as beneficial predators. And here's some other great critters to have in your soil. And again, these may just show up. You may not have to intentionally introduce them. Ladybugs, lady beetles, lacewings. The ladybugs love to eat aphids. Lacewings are also predators. Praying mantises will eat all kinds of different insects, both your beneficials and your pests. But that's okay. This is a food web here, and the beneficials will get eaten too. So that's okay. Ground beetles. You'll see these. I've seen these show up in my compost pile. They are also decomposers, a lot like the rove beetles. And spiders. Some people have this kind of, mostly irrational fear of spiders. I don't know, they just look creepy, but spiders are actually really great. They are predators of a lot of the pest insects that we don't like. They help keep the ecosystem in balance, so it's good to have those too. So we mentioned some of these pests here. You'll see the root aphid with its life cycle, and we also have the fungus gnat and the thrip. So these are all pests, common pests that will decimate your plants. So by introducing just a couple of these critters like springtails and rove beetles, you can be proactive and actually develop a little bit of an IPM strategy, which is that's integrated pest management. That's not really in the scope of this course, but what you'll see here is that if you create this balanced ecosystem and have really healthy plants, like we talked about in the Prevent Any Pest series, if you watched that, the pests, you probably are not going to have much of a pest problem at all. The ecosystem will take care of the pests and keep them in check and you will not have to worry as much about them, if at all. So here, I've just harvested some worm castings from our big worm bin that we have where I live, and you'll see, it's kind of far away, but if you look closely, you'll see that these worm castings are full of springtail mites, and they've got some worms in them too, and they've got some partially decomposed organic material as well. So I'm adding this to the top of my pots here, and what this is going to do is not only provide some really great nutrient-rich fresh worm castings and all that nutrients for the plant, but I'm also essentially inoculating my soil here with springtail mite populations, with some earthworms, also putting additional earthworms in separately. And it's a really great way to also attract, because I'm growing outside, it probably is going to attract lots of other critters. There's already a bunch of roly-polies, isopods in these worm castings as well. So it's doing double duty here. I'm amending, providing some extra nutrients for the soil, and inoculating the soil with lots of micro livestock. And then of course we want to put the rice straw back on top until the cover crop grows. I actually just seeded a cover crop right before this, so cover crop should grow up through those worm castings and through that rice straw, but the rice straw will keep the soil covered, protected, and moist in the meantime. Alright, now we're going to get into the macro livestock. So there are a lot of different animals that you could have on your farm that you could integrate in with growing your crops, but we're going to talk about a few that are especially beneficial, starting with rabbits, and specifically recommending the species of lionhead rabbits. They're just a little bit easier to train, a little more well-behaved. Now, rabbits are ideal if you have a garden where you're growing a crop that will get rather tall, like tomatoes or like cannabis, something that where most of the plant will be out of reach of the rabbit, so the rabbit is not going to do too much damage to your main crop. But if you're growing a cover crop, especially of clovers, close to the ground, you can put that rabbit into your garden and it will munch on that clover, and it will poop and leave deposits of rabbit poop on your soil, which is exactly what you want. You want to get animal manure into your soil. They will trim the cover crops for you, and it's just a great symbiosis here, as long as you're not growing something that's too close to the ground, like lettuce or spinach. Might want to be careful there. The rabbit might start eating that. But again, if you're growing something tall, even something viney like peas, you're going to be okay. And I've even been told, although I've never seen this, that you can train your rabbits to poop in your worm bin, because rabbit poop is actually great food for worms. And rabbit poop is really the number one when it comes to animal manure. It's not hot, but it's also rich in nutrients. In a lot of ways similar to worm castings. You'll get much bigger pellets here than you will from worm castings, but not quite as much as many other animals. So if you collect the rabbit poop, it will dry out pretty quickly, so you'll want to actually soak it in water before you apply it to your soil, but then you can just apply it directly to the soil, no composting needed, and it will be a great fertilizer. Now, another livestock that we recommend for small farms or gardens are sheep. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sheep as opposed to goats, just as a comparison. So goats are actually known for they can be somewhat destructive. They will really eat anything, and they will try to get at anything. They will climb up and eat the bark and leaves off of trees, and they tend to go for that kind of stuff. So if you don't want your goats going after that stuff, you might have some problems with goats. Sheep, on the other hand, are ground grazers, so they're really mostly just going to eat grass and potentially your cover crop that's planted on the ground, so you don't have to worry about them going crazy and eating everything. Both sheep and goats are ruminants. Now, having ruminants is somewhat important because if you're just going to allow them to poop right on your garden or right on your field and just leave it there, their manure has been digested so much that it's typically going to be not as hot as some other manure, although sheep manure is a little hotter than, say, manure from a larger animal like a cow, but it's generally not as hot, and also it's been digested so much that it should be relatively free of harmful pathogens, and weed seeds, should be killed off. Now, another advantage of sheep over goats is that they are pretty docile. As I mentioned, their manure is a little bit more concentrated, but you can get a lot of the same benefits from sheep as you can from goats, and they're kind of medium-sized animals that are pretty docile and easy to control. Now, if you want to go to the next level, alpacas are a great livestock to keep. They are also ground grazers like sheep, and their manure is easy to collect because they have this kind of strange behavior of just wanting to poop in the same place all the time, so it makes it really easy to, if you want to collect it and spread it. And again, these animals can have other benefits. You can harvest the wool of sheep, and you can also harvest the wool of alpaca. Alpaca wool is 30% warmer, it's hypoallergenic, and so as a result is a lot more valuable than sheep's wool, and you can actually do a decent business potentially selling alpaca wool. And finally, cows, of course, are the classic grazing animals that most people are familiar with. They are just so big that you really have to have a pretty large property. You really have to have a full-fledged farm to have cows, so they're not going to probably work as well for your small market garden or your home garden. But cows are also great ruminants that will fertilize the soil with their natural manure. Their manure has a pretty ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio, so again, it doesn't necessarily need to be composted ahead of time. You can just allow them to poop on the field, and they can be used to regenerate ecosystems, as we talked about when we covered regenerative practices. So if you are farming on a slightly larger scale and you want to get your soil ready for planting, you're afraid maybe the soil is not quite nutrient rich enough, then a great thing to do is a season ahead of time, plant a cover crop, and then have the cows eat that cover crop and poop on the field, and you'll get your field in much better shape. And again, this is ultimately the idea of integrating livestock into your garden or your grow or your farm, is that the byproduct they produce is really great for whatever it is. It's really great for fertilizing the soil and for maintaining that balance and diversity in the ecosystem. All right, that's it for the lesson on micro and macro livestock. And next time, we will talk about how to use composts and more about how to use manures to amend and fertilize your garden or grow or farm. So we'll see you next week.